Thank you so much. Folks, how are you doing mentally? Are you still able to focus?
It's a bit personal.
Fantastic. Earlier on, during the expert positioning talk, I hinted at the idea that innovation was one way to set yourself apart and own your industry. What we do now is we follow that branch off the tree. We follow that tributary off the river, and we look at the idea of how to innovate in order to own your industry. And we start by debunking 3 myths. The first thing that people think of when they think innovation is money. It is not expensive to innovate. The second thing that people think of is high tech. You've got to be a Samsung, a Google, or a BMW in order to innovate. I'll show you why that's not true either. And perhaps the third one that has really entered into the public consciousness is that innovation equals an app. Whenever we think innovation these days, it's, ooh, rush out, develop an app. Now that's a good option, but it is one of millions. Innovation really is about using your mind, noticing the things around you, and sometimes it doesn't cost a cent. Here's an example. I'm driving along in Joburg listening to Talk Radio 702, and an ad comes on the radio and says, don't you hate the fact that you have to pay for your plane tickets in full before you can apply for your visa to go overseas? And that one caught my attention. The voiceover then goes on to say, at Virgin Atlantic Airlines, we are the only airline in South Africa who will fully refund your tickets if you don't get your visa. I thought that's brilliant. Here is a tech company with all the money in the world to back them, but that did not cost them a cent. It didn't rely on technology, and it had nothing to do with an app. You know what they did? They asked, what's awful about dealing with us? And they found a way around that. Sometimes knowing what's awful about dealing with ourselves is step number 1 in innovation. And in fact, probably one of the worst and most disastrous marketing stories in all of business history comes directly out of a company refusing to hear what's awful about them. World War II comes to an end, and Great Britain and Germany decide they'd better stop this nonsense before somebody gets hurt. They all go back to their homes, and a guy who was working for the Italian army with a bit of an engineering background, he's been building tanks, and he decides he's going to be an entrepreneur now. And he takes his technical knowledge and he starts up a tractor making factory, and he prospers. Now, as a result of this prosperity, he decides to buy himself his first Ferrari. Anyone here own a Ferrari? That's quite disappointing. Now, for you or I, buying a Ferrari would be a big deal, but for an Italian, it's on a different level. For an Italian, you are talking about something that is, it runs in the blood, it's national pride, it's their history, it's their legacy. It's like this rolling combination of mama and opera and pasta, all in one. So he buys his Ferrari and he adores it, aside from one thing. Every time he tries to go into third gear, there's something awkward about the gear shift. Gets away from the line, first gear, second gear, struggles into third. Slows down from fourth gear, struggles to get into third, and it frustrates him. So when he gets home, he decides to disassemble his Ferrari, and he does so, takes it down to its nuts and bolts, as you do. As he comes up with a better solution for their clutch, he reassembles his Ferrari, pulls off the line, first gear, second gear, third gear, fourth, beautiful. Now because he's a proud Italian, he decides to give this technology to Ferrari free of charge. How's that for customer feedback? He gets to the doors at Ferrari, states his case, the receptionist disappears upstairs, comes back down and says, I'm sorry sir, they won't even meet with you. They turn him away, and he is so angry, so livid, that as he walks down the stairs and approaches his Ferrari, he makes a decision. He decides that he is going to build his own sports car. That afternoon, that is exactly what Dr. Lamborghini did. Ouch. Ooh-ay-ah. Sometimes by not paying attention to what's awful about us, we give our competitors the opportunity to out-innovate us. So, innovation is an important topic, and that's what we're talking about today. But, as I said, it is not a costly topic, and it doesn't rely on technology. Here's my own background in terms of interacting with the idea of innovation. I believe if you ask a different question, you get a different answer. The reason I believe that is because of how I was brought up. I grew up in a fairly nice neighborhood in Johannesburg, but we were the odd ones out. We were kind of everybody's poor cousin, the family that's always struggling to get by. You know, at the time, of course, you feel very sorry for yourself, but as you grow, you start to see lessons and advantages in a slightly different upbringing. Has anyone here seen any of the Spud movies? Yeah? You know the dad in Spud? That's my dad. Right down to the red hair and the beard and the complete lack of social skills. He's a wonderful, highly intelligent man who doesn't really care what the world thinks of him. So, you know, everyone else used to arrive at school, parents would pick them up in the BMWs and the Mercs and the whole trip. My dad, you could hear the brakes squeaking from 3 blocks away. That's how we knew to pick up our bags and start walking. And he'd come around the corner in this beaten up, broken down, rattle-trap station wagon that the kids dubbed Puff the Magic Peugeot. And infallibly, every afternoon, Puff the Magic Peugeot would break down right in front of the school gates. My dad had no issues with getting out of the car and calling the 3 biggest, coolest kids and saying, "Hey, come push." So, you know, that was my background. But at the time, that other kids were playing with things like the Nintendo sets at the time and the quad bikes and so on. We didn't have access to that kind of level of entertainment. When you are a poorer family, you've got to find a way to entertain yourself. Which is probably why me and my little sister exist in the first place. Once you've had the kids, you've got another problem. You've got to find a way to entertain them. So my dad walks out into the backyard, and he doesn't ask the question, how can I get hold of the Nintendo set? He asks, how do I entertain the kids? Different question, we're going to end up with a different answer. He looks around, and there's only one notable feature in the backyard. Next to the boundary wall, in fact in the neighbor's yard, is this tall tree. And at about 30 feet up, there's a single branch that goes over into our yard. My dad thinks, rope swing. But now when most of us think rope swing, we think of like a little peach tree and half a meter of chain, maybe an old bicycle tire, and the kids go back and forth for 10 minutes, get bored and forget about it. Ours was nothing like that. To create it, my dad gets hold of a rock, and he drops it into this canvas sack. Then he ties the sack shut with the end of a rope, stands beneath the branch, and tries to get the rock with the rope over the branch. When he regained consciousness, he had created what became a legendary rope swing in our neighborhood. You see, for starters, you didn't sit in any kind of a tire. At the end of this 30 feet of rope, he had handlebars, and you'd hold on. In fact, you'd hold on above your head. And then you would run the length of the yard. At the end of the yard, the rope would take and your feet would come out from under you, and if you'd run fast enough, your feet would go up over the roof of the house on this side. Then you'd come back down, touch down on the grass, run, and your feet would go over the telephone wires on that side. We had surprisingly few fatalities. Most of those were kids nobody missed anyway, so it wasn't That, though, was my background in my youth, and it was this case of always asking a different question and thinking in weird, sometimes embarrassing, unconventional ways. But the lessons that I took away from that, the patterns of thinking, have been remarkably useful to me. So let's ask ourselves how ideas work. What's the genesis of a human idea, and how does this whole thing of innovation come about? Well, it turns out that all human ideas, all human thinking, works like an inverse pyramid. So you have the first guy who comes along and has an idea. This is our invention of the wheel, or the invention of fire. He puts down his first block. The next person comes along, sees this block and goes, I can see a way that 2 blocks could fit on top of that. Third person comes along and goes, I can see a way to put 3 blocks on top of the 2. And that's how ideas unfold all through human history. Now, it sounds quite simple, but there's something very profound about that. Because the third guy could not have come along and put the 3 blocks down before the 2 and the 1. Everything depends on what came before it. Now, here's your sexy innovation term for the day, and this is one of my favorites. This is called the ever-expanding adjacent possible. How cool is that? The ever-expanding adjacent possible. In other words, with each thing that becomes possible, something else becomes possible next to it. And for that reason, we have to be fascinated by the world around us. We need to be reading books, we need to be attending conferences, we need to be taking in ideas, because there's cool stuff happening all the time. Now, you know from the earlier presentation as well, I like to talk about cars. Here's an example of how the ever-expanding adjacent possible is working in the automotive world right now. No Ferrari owners, anyone here own an Audi? Okay, a few people around the room. If you can hold out for the next one, and if you can afford it by then, wait for the next Audi A8, the big one. Why? Because this one will be able to park itself. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's not a big trick. There are ads on TV right now for Ford Fiestas and Kias that can park themselves. Here's the difference. You have to be in the Kia for it to park itself. Not so with the Audi. Here's what's going to happen. You arrive at your business meeting, you get out of your car. Close it, take out your key, which is really going to start looking like a little iPad, and tell the car to go and park itself. The car is then going to put on its indicators, check for traffic, pull out into the road, and go and do a 10-kilometer radius survey looking for parking. Once it's found a spot, it will park itself and go to sleep. Then you go to your meeting, you come out afterwards, you press your little button, and 10 kilometers away, your car wakes up and comes back to you. Once again, how cool is that? But now think about the number of expanding adjacent possibles that went into making that happen. We didn't start right back with the wheel, but let's start more recently. Mercedes-Benz invents the car. Then someone comes along and decides we need cruise control so that this car can keep going without human input. That has expanded the adjacent possible. But at this stage you have an unintelligent projectile. The car can drive itself, but it will drive itself off a cliff or into a tree if you let it. Then we introduce things like guided positioning systems. And we also introduce lasers and radar and sonar so the car can check out what's going on around it. Mercedes, again, decides, you know what would make cars safer is if they could tell where the white line is in the middle of the road. And when you start veering into the line, it warns you or subtly pushes you back. They didn't intend the consequence to be a self-driving car. But add all of that together, now you've got a car that knows where the lanes are, can read for traffic around it, can drive by itself, knows where it is in relative to other things, and can tootle off and park itself. The ever-expanding adjacent possible. And it opens up new ones beyond that as well. Because why just send your car to park? Why not send it home for your spouse to drive? Or why not send your car to do deliveries for you? You know, it can go and do some work while you're in your meeting. Why not? You have to wonder where that's going to go in South Africa. I mean, I've got this mental image of a cop pulling a car over, and there's no one in it. Practically speaking for us, it only has this simple implication. You've got to be interested in the world around you. You've got to be constantly saying to yourself, that's awesome, now imagine if. And in fact, sometimes innovation doesn't even feel like a huge breakthrough for the person doing it. You're just looking at how a thing is done over there and trying it in your scenario. But in adopting it and adapting it, you move the idea slightly forward. That's awesome. Now imagine if. So this afternoon, we're going to broadly look at 3 chunks of information. The first, like the expert positioning talk, is why bother? I think some of the reasons are self-evident, but there's more to it as well. The second reason is, if I sell you on the idea of innovating, right, why don't we? If it's so good, and if we buy into it emotionally and intellectually, why don't we already do it? And then the third thing is, how practically can we go about it? Because I feel for most people, we get the idea that you should. It's become such a buzzword, such a trend. The difficult part is going, where are the levers? How do I actually start to make innovation happen? So, starting off with the why bothers. The first one is excellence sustained becomes invisible. Or in other words, the longer you do something perfectly, the less people notice. You can run your business flawlessly. In fact, it works the same way in large corporate companies. If you're building a career, you can do your job perfectly. And the more perfectly you do it, the less people will notice. When do they notice you again? Mushroom cloud on the horizon, who did that? And suddenly all eyes are on you. Now that one's a bit of a trap, and it's an interesting one because it's a trap that befalls people who are perfectionists and are doing their jobs well. The longer they do it, the less people notice. A solution to that is the splash factor of innovation. It's an opportunity to get new, positive attention. Second reason it's worth your while, changes make your excellence irrelevant. You are the world's best manager of a chain of video stores. Netflix comes along and makes you redundant. Doesn't matter how good your leadership skills were, the world has changed. It has moved on. Let's get ahead of that change. Let's be the ones doing the changing, not the ones getting caught out by it. Number 3, unconventional armies tend to win. Anyone here read a fair amount of Malcolm Gladwell? Yeah? When I'm Emperor of the Universe, Malcolm Gladwell will be compulsory reading. You may as well get on with it now. One of his best books, David and Goliath, he talks about a study, genuine study that was done, looking at wars and battles over the last, I think it was 300 years. And the conclusion that they reached was astonishing. They said when you are the inferior army, or the inferior side, taking on a superior force, you've got something like a 75% chance of losing. Pretty much your history. But when you refuse to play by the accepted rules of warfare, when you do things in unconventional, unexpected ways, your chances of winning go up to around 75%. And that's a switch from you're probably going to lose to you're probably going to win. That's very interesting when you're taking on bigger brands and bigger opponents. The next one, even your most ardent supporters do not want another wooden bowl. A year ago, Wednesday night, my wife and I are sitting watching The Mentalist. The gate rings outside. My wife gets up and has a look, and there's this smiling, portly lady, and she's down from Malawi. She has this whole speech that she gives to my wife about how she does not beg, she's an entrepreneur, she's here in this country earning her way, and she's selling these beautiful wooden bowls. Well, it was irresistible, so we bought her bowl. And it now sits at the front desk, and that's where our keys go and so on. 1 week later, Wednesday night, we're watching The Mentalist, and the doorbell rings. Ma'am, would you like to buy another wooden bowl? She has been back every Wednesday for the last year trying to sell us a second wooden bowl. We like her, we support her. We don't need another wooden bowl. Now, if she just took the core thing that she does and thought about more innovative ways of expanding that offering, she could have us. She might say things like, man, enjoy your wooden bowl. Next week, I'll be coming past with wooden key rings, and I'll just show you what they look like. See you then. The week after that, I'll have wooden carvings of a relief map of Africa, and I'll see you when I'll show you that. The week after that, ma'am, I have a beautiful carving of our president paying back the money. Would you like that? I buy that. Number 5, it is a brave, bold answer to cutbacks. Whenever we go through recessions, most corporate thinking goes, cut costs, shrink, conserve. Innovation says no, let's be bold, let's try to grow. One of my favorite speakers in the United States is a guy named Randy Gage. And he says in 2008, the world issued an invitation to go into recession, and I politely declined. And he teaches businesses how to think that way. I love it. Number 6, it unlocks hidden budgets. If you're a commodity, an expected thing, the answer may be yes or no based on price. If you're something novel, something unusual, something unique, that can unlock a hidden budget. You might get the sale despite the fact that they've initially said there's no money available. And perhaps the most interesting one for us is what I call the meteorite strike that no one noticed. In 2014, last year, a company called Yellowwood Marketing Agency did a survey. And the findings of the survey, I met these guys on a couch outside Mags on Media. I just launched the book that you saw earlier, Own Your Industry, and Penguin had sent me to go do an interview with Jeremy Maggs. Now we're sitting outside his studio on the squeaky leather couch, and next to me is this guy from Yellowwood Agency. And we're talking about why we're both there, and I describe my book, and I say, what are you here for? And he says, we think something fundamental has shifted and changed in the South African business landscape. No one's talking about it. I said, well, you've got my attention. Can you explain it to me in the 30 seconds you've got left before they call you into studio? He said, yes, I can. It's this. South Africans no longer care about legacy. They are only responding to how you are innovating into my world today. And then he got up and walked into the studio. I thought that is massively profound. Because what we're seeing there is the shift away from, look at the size of our buildings, look how old our bank is, look how grand our institution is. South Africans no longer care. We're responding to, what are you doing in my world today? And that is a massive opportunity for smaller companies, and it is a huge threat for the bigger legacy brands. Right, so those are some of the reasons why we should. Why don't we? In fact, just off the top of your head, what do you reckon gets in the way of innovation? What do you think? Sorry? Stagnation, somebody said, yeah. Time, the time to do it.
Fear, willpower.
Fear is a very big one. Willpower, someone has to drive it. What else?
Lack of imagination.
Lack of imagination, we don't have the time to think. We just get so process driven that we don't have the time. Anything else?
Incompetency.
Incompetence, yeah. Here are some of my top ones. The first one is what I call inherited thinking. And the trick here is that the thinking handed down to us becomes invisible to us. Or in other words, the way it's always been done just seems right. It isn't necessarily right, but it seems that way because to us, that's simply the way things are. Now, the building that you're looking at here, this is an old, grainy photograph of an Industrial Revolution era factory. And it looks, to my mind, surprisingly like a modern school. And there are reasons for that. Check out the similarities. The guys arrive at work and they line up outside and the foreman blows a whistle. Your kids line up outside the school and a bell rings, or a teacher blows a whistle. In their lines, they march to their workstations and they sit down in rows. Same thing with the kids. They have to work at their workstations for a set number of hours, at which point the foreman blows the whistle and they can pick up their lunch boxes and walk outside. Same with your kids. After they've had their lunch, the whistle blows, the bell rings, the foreman, the teacher leads them back to their workstation, they sit in rows and they produce for a set number of hours. At the end of those hours, the bell goes, the whistle rings, whatever the case might be, whistle goes, bell rings, and then they can go home. Now we look at that and we go, well, that's just the way a school is. Nonsense. A school is that way because it was designed to create the right kind of worker for that kind of economy. We look at a school now and we go, but that's just the way it is. No, it was designed for a purpose, but the thinking handed down to us becomes invisible to us. We look at it and we go, that's just the way it's done. I don't necessarily have a better model for a school. The point is just that we buy into how things are always done and it becomes invisible to us. Second reason we don't innovate. Sometimes the rules trump the goals. It's a bit dark there, but that's a city scene in Cairo. Anyone here been to Cairo in Egypt? Okay. I've been once, I went on a little tour bus. A friend of mine gets onto a similar bus. It's almost like our minibus taxis here in South Africa. He's the only guy in this little bus doing a tour around the streets of Cairo. And it's quite built up and quite densely packed. And there they go zipping around these little city streets. They get around the corner, wham, over a pedestrian, knock him down in the street. My friend is speechless. The guy goes into reverse, looks in his rearview mirror, and quickly drives back over him. He goes into first gear, drives over him a third time, and toodles off around the corner. My friend says, what on earth was that all about? He says, no, sir, you need to understand. We have a rule here that if you hurt a person, you are responsible for them for the rest of your life. Good rule. When you think about it, I mean, it's a very socially conscious rule. But look at the end result of the rule. It's absolute anarchy. Sometimes the rules become more important than the goals that guided them in the first place. We often see that happen in big companies with things like the job description. If it's on my job description, I shalt. If it is not, I shalt not. And the job description was really a way of showing you what the goals are. But it suddenly becomes a set of rules, and you may or may not do them. Sometimes the rules actually get in the way of the goals. Number 3, there's a group of people in every company that I lovingly call the efficiency Hitlers. And they spend their time fine-tuning the machine. Now, not to be disparaging, we actually have to have efficiency Hitlers. But they are constantly at war with the innovators. And it's a leadership issue. Here's what happens. Our efficiency Hitlers take the system and they incrementally make it better and better and better and better. What they don't want is the disruption of the innovators. They don't want the mess, the cost, or the interruption. What we actually have to have is leadership telling these two groups that they have different, complementary goals. So, you need the innovators to come up with the new thing. Then you hand it over to the systems peoples, the efficiency Hitlers, and let them make it better and better and better and better, on the understanding that at a certain point, we're going to dump it and start again. Then the radical disruptors come up with a new thing, and then the efficiency Hitlers must make it better and better and better, but don't get emotionally attached because it's going. And that's a leadership issue. And if leaders would only tell these two groups of people what's going on, they wouldn't have to be at war with one another. Sometimes the efficiency Hitlers are going to have to compromise on quality or cost or process, whatever the case might be, in order to let the radical disruptors try something crazy. Next one. There's a uniquely human reason that we don't innovate. We do a thing called hallowing the script. Or in other words, we have in our minds a preconceived idea of the pure way that our job should be done. There's a brilliant book by Pixar that talks about this in one of its chapters. And they say when new students are trained in the Disney studios, they start off wanting to animate the way Walt Disney did it in the 1920s. They want to sit with pages and draw in pencil and do pure animation. And they actually have a hard time, the professors, getting it through these kids' heads that if Walt Disney had had computers in the 1920s, he would have used them. But we do that quite often. We have this idea of the pure version, the script of what we think a job should be. And by trying to play that role, we close our thinking to the other opportunities. In fact, quite often, people in positions of leadership or any position that they get into will feel like frauds after a while because they have this pure idea of what the job should be, and it's in contradiction to what they actually end up doing every day. Let's say you become a newspaper editor. You think you're going to be barking out tough orders to hardened journalists, but actually what you end up doing is spending most of your day checking spelling and checking grammar. Now you feel like a fraud. But actually the thing you're doing every day is the real version of your job. Hallowing the script gets in the way of innovation. And sometimes when we let go and let the new thing happen, there's magic available there. Another reason we don't innovate, probably the most obvious one, we're just too close. We are too operational, we're too busy. We don't have the time to think. That's what a session like this one is all about. It's the opportunity to zoom back, take a moment of time to think, breathe out and go, all right, where are the opportunities? So, practically speaking, how do we innovate? Here are some useful ideas. The first one, ask yourself, what are we actually trying to achieve? What are we actually trying to achieve? I said early on, if you ask a different question, you will get a different answer. Here's a profound example. If you happen to be running a water-stressed country, region, area, something like in Egypt or in Israel or in Kalahari, whatever the case might be, what's the best type of food to grow? Any guesses? Yeah, water-wise, in order to be efficient and get out as much, produce as much food as you possibly can. Take a guess, what do you think?
Rooibos.
Rooibos, okay. Good South African answer.
Aloe.
Aloe, okay.
Olives.
Olives. Turns out the correct answer is, in fact, fish. Fish. Bizarre, but true. If you do the maths, it turns out that it takes less water to farm fish than to grow anything else that you can imagine. How strange is that? Now, if you'd started with a question, how do we grow the maximum amount of maize, given that we are a water-stressed area, you'd have gotten an answer to that question. But if you ask a different question, which is what are we trying to achieve here? Feed the most people using the least water, the answer, it turns out, is fish. Absolutely true. Strange, but true. There's the old example of the guy running a hardware store. They sell 16-inch drill bits. And he calls his team together, his sales guys, and he says, guys, what do we sell? And they all say, 16-inch drill bits. And he says, no, we sell 16-inch holes in walls. And that's the difference. If you can think of a different way to put a 16-inch hole in a wall, that is innovation. Ask, what are we trying to achieve here? You end up with different answers at the end of that question. Idea number 2. Ask yourself, which walls must go? Anyone here following Elon Musk's growing career? Fascinating, fascinating human being. Born in South Africa, lives in California now, and according to almost anything that you read, whether you're following like Forbes or Bloomberg, Entrepreneur, probably the world's leading innovator today. He's the head of SpaceX, he's the head of Tesla Motors and a few others, and just absolutely rocking the world and fundamentally changing things. If you walk into the SpaceX buildings, now this is a building where they create real rockets that go into outer space. You walk in the front door, you can see the back wall. Why? Because there are no divisions. Why is that? Because he wants people talking to each other. He wants different patterns of thinking interacting across the company. Sure, they have sections, but he reckons the walls must go. If you keep your toaster makers in the toaster making department, you'll get better and better toasters. If you keep your rocket makers in the rocket making department, you'll get better and better rockets. If you let your toaster makers and your rocket makers meet and mingle, you'll end up with rocket-powered toasters. Or toast-powered rockets. Or pregnant employees. You never know which way.